The Office of Vermont State Auditor is where the state's spending is monitored and reviewed. It's an elected position, and the incumbent officeholder, Douglas Hoffer, has held that post since 2013. He is being challenged this year by Representative Linda Joy Sullivan, who has represented 5 local towns, including Dorset and Danby, since 2017. We recently heard from Representative Sullivan as to why she's running in the Democratic Party's primary, scheduled for August 11th, for the auditor position. Now we have a chance to hear from Mr. Hoffer about the position and some of the cases he has handled over the past 7 years.
Well, first of all, Mr. Hoffer, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today. I guess just to get started, I wondered if you could just sort of describe the job of the state auditor. What does that person do, and what happens in the office?
I'd rather talk about what the office does.
Okay.
I do. I supervise people who do a lot of good work, but basically we have 3 primary responsibilities. One is to do the audit of the state's financial statements. The second is to do what's called a single audit, which all states must do by OMB rules, which is basically a compliance audit for the money that comes from the federal government. And the third, thankfully, is performance auditing. The first 2 that I mentioned are, and now for some time, have been done by a contracted entity. It was KPMG for a number of years, and about 3 years ago, I switched to a different firm. I thought it was time for some new set of eyes. So they do both of those. They're very important. The first, the CAFR, so-called to Wall Street. They like to know that the money is where it's supposed to be, and understandably so. The second is required, as I say, by the federal government, the single audit, and it's important because if there are findings, if we are found to have, I don't want to say violated, but not met the requirements of whatever federal money it is from education or public safety, justice, then they have a finding which requires a corrective action and a subsequent re-audit, which is more money. So I'm happy to say that we brought those way down during my tenure, thanks in part to the folks at Finance and Management otherwise. The last one, performance auditing, interestingly, is something that began in the 90s nationally as a nascent new requirement for state auditors. And I was doing some contract work for the state auditor at that time. That was Ed Flanagan, you may remember the name. And he began to express interest in that, as did other state auditors as it was developing. And now that's all we do with our in-house staff. And I think it's extremely valuable because it's not enough to say, we know that the money raised was spent as appropriated and all the T's are crossed and I's dotted. That's the beginning of the conversation, not the end. In truth, our office can help the administration and the legislature determine whether, in fact, they got what they expected. Did the program that was created and funded achieve the goals intended? That sort of thing, which is up my alley because I'm a policy guy by trade. I did that for 20 years before I was elected, so I enjoy that. And had that not been the case, I wouldn't have wanted the job, to be very honest. So performance auditing is mostly what we do.
So how do you decide which programs require an audit? Is there a red flag of some sort that kind of pops up and says, hey, we need to look into this a little more closely?
It's a mixed bag. Some reflect the amount of money at issue, so-called materiality, which is the term of art. Obviously, you want to follow the programs that expend great sums. In addition, you want to look at those where there may have been previous findings of problems, either in the program or the department, insufficient or inadequate internal controls, and they can't track the money, that kind of thing. And we've done quite a few of those. I would refer to them more as nuts and bolts, as to the operations of state government, as opposed to programmatic performance audits. The latter being much more difficult because it's often hard to get good data. I can give you some examples of the nuts and bolts. We did a job a few years ago at the Buildings and General Service, which has responsibility for the state's capital projects, not transportation, just all the others, courthouses, that sort of thing. And we looked at 9 jobs, which originally were scoped out for about $92 million. Well, they were $24 million over budget. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. You know, it's not just one person's fault, and it's not even all BGS's fault, but a lot of things led to that result, which is not a good result. We also did a job at Human Resources Department looking at how they deal with allegations of employee misconduct. You know, this is kind of inside baseball obviously important to state employees, but there's a money angle as well. If you are alleged to have committed some workplace assault or some problem, and you are entitled to an investigation, but if your supervisor decides that until the determination is made as to whether it occurred and to what extent and what, if any, discipline is required, they say to you, we don't want you in the office for the next few weeks. We're alone. Go home. We're going to pay you. There's an assumption of innocence. And that's called relief from duty. And it's not uncommon. It doesn't happen that often, but it's not uncommon. And we found that over 4 years, the state spent $7 million paying people not to work. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's not appropriate. There are always instances where you should have been sent home. I don't mean you, of course, but the hypothetical. But we found some problems in how quickly they were ready to turn it around. And if your supervisor was not in the end going to fire you, then you should get back to work as soon as possible. So that was another one. And we had some fun ones. One of the first jobs we did was of the company hired to provide healthcare in the prison system. This is back in 2013. And among other things, we found quite by accident, this is my first experience with audit art. There were a couple of people down at the Springfield prison waiting to meet with some folks, and they noticed a trash can off to the side in the office that had in it some of these sheets of prescription drugs. You know how we buy them at the store, and there's maybe 4 or 6 in each one, but these were full-size sheets, and it was filled with them. And they learned later that they were drugs, prescription drugs, made available to prisoners who had since left or been let go, they completed their sentence, whatever the case may be, and they threw them away. Well, we found that in the contract, they could have returned them for credit. Well, they took our suggestion. Next year, they saved $450,000. So that's fun stuff. And the last one on nuts and bolts, just for the heck of it, we looked at cell phone use. Because when I first started in 13, that was relatively new for state government. And not surprisingly, because we have, to some extent, as you probably know, a decentralized state government in many ways, 5 large entities, natural resources, transportation, and so forth, had been very generous, I mean, personally, but they had provided cell phones to a lot of employees. So we were interested in how that turned out. Well, they had 5 million unused minutes because a lot of people didn't need cell phones. And they got a kind of a lousy deal from the companies and so forth. So it was kind of a mess, but it was estimated they could save about $675,000 a year. Now that doesn't sound much in a $6 billion budget, but there's a lot of these little things lying around. And it's not, as some people assume, corruption or incompetence. It's just that, for example, natural resources, they have a primary focus, natural resources. Nobody ever guessed that they knew about cell phones. There were people who should be doing that for all of us. So anyway, on the programmatic side, which is much tougher, again, because it's often difficult to find the right data, we've done a number of jobs related to healthcare at DEVA, Department of Vermont Health Access. One of them was around Dr. Dinosaur, which has been around since Howard Dean's time, as I'm sure you know, for kids. And we looked at a sample of households that it was determined they were not eligible. For whatever reason, their income had not been updated, the system missed them, they might have provided inaccurate information, whatever the case may be. But during the period when they were not eligible, technically, the state continued to pay for their health care because the system thought that they were eligible. Well, that was $2.4 million that shouldn't have been paid for the health care for those folks. The state knew that that was a problem a number of years back and tried to fix it twice, unsuccessfully, and spent $1.9 million in the process. So there's things like that that pop up over time. And then we do a number of investigations. There was a position in my office when I came in, which was used for communications, which I didn't think we needed. I'm communicating with you just fine as far as I can tell. So we didn't need a whole person to do that. So I repurposed that position to an investigator, a government investigator, who is not an auditor, but does very rigorous work with me and with my deputy on a number of really interesting subjects. And as a rule, they don't take as long as the so-called GAGAS audits, the audits that are done to generally accepted government auditing standards. They're very rigorous in terms of documentation. And some of those are fascinating. The first one was on healthcare price transparency, of which there's almost none. as I'm sure you know. If you go in for a procedure and you say, how much is this going to cost? They go, well, who knows? We'll have to wait and see. Too many variables. It's the only major purchase in your life that you don't know the cost up front. And I think, as you would probably agree, we have a right to that. That was a great report. We also did an interesting one on purchasing. You may recall 100 years ago, state and local governments were often corrupt. Not all of them, but many of them. If a contract for banking or insurance had to go out, they'd say, let Fred do it. We know Fred, he's a good guy, or he's the cousin of the mayor, whatever the case may be. So that led to a number of changes in government, including civil service for one, but also rules about competitive bids for contracts. That is the rule for state government. There are some exceptions where you don't have to do competitive bidding. It's called sole source contracting. For example, after Irene, we didn't have time to go through, all that stuff, the paperwork. So they said, we know there's a contractor in that town, get them to work tomorrow, that kind of thing. That's fine. Or if there's a product or service which is only available from your firm. But those are for extraordinary times. We found in looking at quite a few of these things for a whole year that 27% of all the contracts that the state entered in that year were sole source contracts, totaling over $60 million. So again, it's not, the people are fond of thinking state government's corrupt or incompetent. They're not. And to some extent, I'm always annoyed when we report our findings because I don't want to reinforce that idea. It's just that people can do better in some cases. So that was a good one. Another one that was interesting that you may have heard about was about the lease of state lands for ski areas. Now, the federal government does that mostly in the West and some in Vermont, but we have 6 or 7 areas that lease land at altitude. And back in the 50s, when the whole industry was born in, there was a guy at A&R, now A&R, who understood that there was some potential here to grow this industry. And he said, what if we lease you that land above elevation, because the state owned a lot of it? And everybody thought that was a great idea, and it was. However, the leases that were developed back in the day had no relation to today's resorts, which are 4-season and have enormous amounts of real estate. There's a whole bunch of stuff that was never anticipated. So we wanted to look at the lease terms and the revenues that come from those leases and get a sense, it's a bit subjective, of whether we thought taxpayers were getting a fair return on that incredibly valuable resource. And the answer was no, it's not, in my opinion. The data shows pretty clearly that they could pay us a lot more. But nobody liked those findings. So when the legislature received it, the industry said, we'd rather not discuss that. And they had the right to say that because the leases, which have been extended multiple times, and none of them are up for renewal until 2052. Because they go, admittedly, ski area needs a lot of capital investment. And to protect that, you got to give them a long term on at least 20, 30 years. But every time they had an opportunity, they'd ask the state to extend them for another 20 or 30. And the key is all those leases said, these terms cannot be changed without the approval of the lessee. The ski areas get to say no to any changes we would make in those leases. So, not surprisingly, nothing's been done. I keep talking. If you want to interrupt, just yell.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's quite interesting. There were a couple of cases in particular I just wanted to kind of ask you about, simply because I've heard a fair amount of commentary about them, and one of them is that those veggie grants, the Vermont Economic Growth Incentive grants. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you've had some concerns about those grants, of whether or not they sort of paid off in the long run by companies actually hiring new workers or more workers and so forth. Is that the case, or?
That is true. I've been talking about this literally for 20 years, because when I did work for Flanagan in the 90s, Veggie's predecessor program was called EATI and was set up, I think, in 97. You may recall Howard Dean was told that this Canadian company called Husky was going to be the next IBM. And any governor would say, oh my God, this is a great opportunity. Let's pull out the stops, do whatever we can. So they created this program. At that point, Vermont did not have much in the way of traditional, what we now consider traditional business incentive programs. So they created EATI, and that went on until 2006. And it was circling the bowl for a few years because it was determined by the state's economists and the legislature's economists and others to be deeply flawed. So they said, how can we make this better? So they did make some changes, and it became what we now know as VEGI in 2006. And the problem I have is that while there are a number of positive elements, you don't get the money unless you create the jobs and so forth, the core, the foundation, the touchstone of this thing is what's called the but for. You as an applicant come in and say to the council, if not for this incentive, I would not create 27 new jobs, invest $2 million in new plant and equipment and so forth. I can't do it without this incentive. Well, in fact, your decision is a corporate one made in your boardroom. Now, while I have access as state auditor to virtually everything that's produced by state government, you're a private entity. I can't access the evidence necessary, and we need evidence to determine whether, in fact, your but-for self-attestation is true. Absent that, I don't know whether VEPSI's, that's the parent entity, the Economic Progress Council, 9 of the 11 are appointed by the governor. I can't tell you, if you're a legislature, whether, in fact, the jobs created would not have been created if not for the incentive. Interestingly, about a year and a half ago, the guy who I think everyone would agree is the preeminent researcher in the country on these issues, issued a report, and he took the time to look at 30 different studies, specifically about the but-for, all over the country. And he said, in the end, my finding is that at least 75% of all of the economic activity supposedly incentivized would have happened anyway. And in many cases, it's as much as 98%. That doesn't surprise me. Business people are not stupid. You don't expand the business unless there's more demand for whatever the heck you're selling. It's a big deal to borrow money or raise equity or one or both and build a new plant, expand your plant, hire 20, 30, 40 people. That's a huge obligation and responsibility and risk. So if you come to the state and say, boy, given the way the program's set up, I might be eligible for $300,000 or $400,000. Well, great, but if your project if your payroll over 5 years is $8 million, does the $300,000 really qualify as a critical factor in your decision? I don't know. But I have a report coming out on that. I went to the trouble to dig in a little bit and look at VEPSI's due diligence and how they respond to the materials provided by the company. So that should be out in a month. Maybe a little more.
All right. Well, we'll have to keep our eyes open for that one then. I guess another thing that I wondered somewhat more recently, well, yes and no, this whole situation with the Vermont State Colleges. As you know, last week, then Chancellor Jeb Spaulding came up with a proposal to close three of the campuses or shift the one in Randolph Technical College to Williston. That prompted a large outcry. Proposal was shelved. Mr. Spaulding resigned as the chancellor. But of course, I guess everybody was pretty much aware that the college system had been in trouble, or at least in financial difficulty, for a while. I guess, do you think that this should have been a situation that should have been audited, or maybe you were already auditing it? What were the findings?
First of all, it's my understanding, having been around and paid some attention to this, although we've never audited the state colleges, excuse me, that Jeb and his predecessors have been coming to the legislature for years, reminding them that by national standards, Vermont was one of the cheapest states in the country in terms of support for both UVM and the state colleges. That doesn't mean it's nothing. It's not nothing. It's a lot of money. But as a percentage of their total revenues and costs, it's rather modest. I think right now it's well under 20% for the state colleges. And I happened to call, when this stuff came up, I called their CFO, who I know a little bit. He used to be the deputy treasurer with Beth Pierce, and he's a straight arrow and a smart guy. And I asked him some questions about it, and he said, he was in Maine a year or so ago, and the now former head of the Maine State College system was there. And they were talking, and Steve was, bemoaning the fact that they didn't get a lot of money from the state. And the guy said, "We know. That's why we can attract a bunch of your students because they get more from the state and can offer a better financial deal to the kids." So that's part of the problem. I don't think there's any question about it. Having said that, I've now heard from some people who have spent more time on this issue that the mission and scope and scale of what we now know to be the campuses and the build out and the infrastructure and the focus of each school may not be advantageous or the most advantageous or optimal for our needs. And there's a lot of ideas flying around. Whether they can make that happen is up to not just the board at the colleges, but the legislature. And I know they're working hard on it, but we have not done an audit of the state colleges. I have no reason to believe there's a problem with the money, except that they don't have enough. And I also heard that I think, one of the things that you hear from your own college and about other colleges, of all of those that come in as freshmen, fresh women, how many stay 4 or 5 years and graduate, or in some cases 2 to get an A? And I think the state colleges numbers were not good for any number of reasons.
One other situation I believe your office was involved with was sort of examining the finances around the One Care system. That seemed to have prompted some concerns. I was reading an old interview that VT Digger had done with you a few months back. Has that situation clarified or improved any to your feeling, or are we still in a bit of a quandary there?
Well, it's a quandary for sure. This is, it doesn't get enough attention, in my opinion. This is one of the biggest things happening in the state. The model was developed largely by some people here in concert with Medicare and some other federal folks at CMS. And in theory, it sounds perfectly reasonable. The so-called all-payer model, pay providers a set fee to keep you healthy rather than fee for service. It does sound sensible and may well be over time, but to shift this much of our healthcare into a brand new system has a lot of risk. And at present, there are 3 players. One of them is the state with a contract for Medicaid, and we pay about half the cost of Medicaid. Medicare is all federal, of course, and then the privates. I think Blue Cross is involved. We are nearing completion of a very substantial audit of both the Green Mountain Care Board's oversight and DEVA and the structure of One Care. Because I know that when we started, there was a lot I didn't understand about it. It's complicated. So the first job we're doing is basically a descriptive audit. It's going to tell you, the reader, in some detail. I hope people can stay with it. We're trying to make it accessible in the language and structure. What the heck this means, what it is, who the players are, what their obligations are, and so forth. Following that, immediately, because there's a little more performance data available, we're going to start a second audit about performance. The risky thing is that this thing is a 5-year obligation with CMS, and that's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, gigantic federal entity. And the 5 years are up in 22. So the state is going to have to make a decision in 21 as to whether re-up for another 5 years. We are not going to have, in our view, and many others, sufficient information to make that determination. The other awkward piece is that the entity itself, One Care, now has over 60 employees. Their proposed budget for the coming fiscal year was $19 million, but they don't provide healthcare services. They support the integrated system. So and that money is not counted by the Green Mountain Care Board in its estimate each year of whether they've saved or lost money. So there's a lot going on. It's a little complicated. It's very complicated. But the report, we're probably not going to release it during this part of the pandemic. We might wait till midsummer, but that should help a little bit.
I was just wondering, with the state about to receive a $1.25 billion, I believe is the total in federal funds under the CARES Act to help us cope with the COVID-19 crisis. I'm wondering, are you thinking, boy, we got to really keep our eyes open on how that money gets spent?
We
Is
are.
there real potential that could go to the wrong places because everyone's got their got their arms and voices raised, looking for it.
There are several elements, and we are already engaged. And we found a few things that were interesting already, but some of it down the road, literally in the next month or two, will be much more transparent because the legislature has made clear, as is their constitutional right, that the money, most of that 1.2, is going to have to be appropriate. The administration, no administration has the authority to just spend it. Our Constitution says not one check can be cut that wasn't appropriated by the legislature. So there's going to be a lot of talk over the next few months about what to do with that 1.2, and the sooner the better, because right now it has to be spent before the end of the calendar year, which is a challenge in itself, which argues for things like, shovel-ready infrastructure. But so that's part of it. But each of these silos, the 1.2 is basically a giant block grant, but what you spend it on will relate to other obligations from the federal government that have their own internal controls and rules for how you can spend money for, whether it's transportation or education or so forth. And the best intentioned people, if they rush, can make mistakes. And in some cases, if you make mistakes, there will be penalties. For example, in unemployment insurance at the Department of Labor, they're overwhelmed and they're doing their best, but nobody ever expected anything like this. But they're doing something unusual because of the federal law. They're making it available to the self-employed. Well, some of the self-employed, we know, have also tried to get a loan that can be converted to a grant from the PPP, right? That's the loans from SBA to help you pay your workers' salaries while they're out. Or if you're self-employed, you could get one for yourself and then turn around and apply for unemployment. So there might be people double dipping, not because they're crooks, just because they're saying, hey, the program sounds like it's right for me and so forth. So there's all that kind of stuff. We also learned that some sheriffs have tried to get into that program, but they're not eligible, they're government entities. So there's things we'll keep an eye on. We are developing a sense of this new world and our responsibility. I've got 2 staff people on this almost full time, and we only have right now 9 professional auditors. That's a pretty big commitment of time, and it'll be more going forward.
We have about a minute or so left, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to just say to voters who may be hearing this down here why they should vote for you in the primary.
Voters, that's what this is about, voters. I'd rather speak to citizens who are in the work we do or have questions about state government and need information or some guidance. If we can be of any help, contact us anytime.
Okay. Well, Mr. Hoffer, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you carving it out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to be with us. And maybe we'll have a chance to have another conversation in a studio. Proper one.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.